Why did they always go for the scars first? That's what Grace Mallory thought as the voice cut through the morning haze like a dull blade. Nice bruises, princess. Didn't know Fort Kesler had spa days. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sting lived in the silence after it. The kind that told you this wasn't just a joke, it was a test. Private Wade Huxley smirked as he stepped back in line, pleased with himself. Around him, the others shifted, some amused, some avoiding eye contact. But everyone heard it. Everyone was watching her. Grace stood alone on the training field. The Wyoming sun already biting, dust clinging to her skin, sweat carving small rivers down the lines of her neck. Her tank top was soaked, her arms mottled with bruises that didn't look new. They were layered, purple fatting to yellow, like the skin was still remembering what broke it. She didn't speak, didn't react, not even a blink. Behind her, the formation tightened slightly, as if waiting for a response. But there was none. Just her stillness, quiet, measured, unsettling. It wasn't pride. It was endurance. The kind that comes from someone who's been broken before and decided not to stay that way. No one here knew her story. They only knew the rumor, a transfer order stamped Directive 17C, no explanation. No welcome packet, just a name on a roster and a whisper that the new sergeant was special. Special meant a lot of things in a place like this. It meant she was either a problem or a legend. Nobody cared which, as long as she didn't make them look bad. Huxley, though, he cared. He was the kind who needed to prove himself by finding someone smaller to bruise. And Grace, standing there in silence, gave him nothing to push against. That silence angered him more than any comeback could. "How many push-ups does it take to snap a wrist, Sarge?" he called out, his grin spreading. "Or did you trip over your own ego again?" A few chuckles. Nervous, testing laughter. That kind of sound that spreads only when people believe the target won't fight back. Grace's knuckles tightened around the edge of her thigh so slight no one noticed. Her jaw flexed once. Then she exhaled, slow, controlled. From a small ridge beyond the field, a figure watched. General Thomas Barkley. Hands clasped behind his back, posture straight, face unreadable. He didn't need to say anything yet. He'd seen this kind of scene before too many times. He'd also seen her before. When Grace Mallory stepped out of the Humvee that morning, he'd known this moment would come. Knew the others would test her, because silence makes men nervous. And her kind of silence, the kind built from loss, could unnerve anyone. She hadn't asked to be here. She'd volunteered. That, more than anything, told Barkley she was carrying something heavy. Down on the field, Huxley smirked again, thinking he'd won. Grace's eyes flicked upward just once, not at him but beyond him, toward the horizon. The kind of look that doesn't see the world but measures it. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She didn't need to speak to say, "I've survived worse men than you." The formation waited for the explosion that never came. And then Barkley's voice came down from the ridge, calm and sharp like gravel dragged across steel. "Call sign Widow 27. Everything stopped. The laughter, the murmurs, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Huxley blinked. "Widow what?" The general stepped forward, his boots hitting the dirt with a rhythm that sounded like judgment. When he reached them, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You just ran your mouth at Widow 27, son." The name rippled through the formation like wind through dry grass. A few soldiers straightened instinctively, others froze. Private Keller, the youngest in the unit, mouthed the word silently. "No way." Everyone had heard that name. It was one of those whispered legends you didn't ask about. Stories told under low lights in the mess, half believed, half dreaded. Widow 27, the ghost soldier, the one who vanished for 5 days behind the land divide and came back carrying her squadmate through enemy fire. The one who didn't die when everyone else did. Except that was a myth, a campfire story, a cautionary tale for recruits. It couldn't be her. Not this woman with bruises on her arms and silence in her eyes. General Barkley looked at Huxley with the weight of years behind his gaze. "You don't need to understand what it means," he said softly, "but you'd better remember it." Behind Grace, one of the senior instructors straightened to attention, not because protocol demanded it, but because something inside him told him to. And in that moment, silence didn't isolate her anymore. It surrounded her like armor. Barkley turned slightly, his eyes sweeping across the field. "You ever heard of Operation Ghost Line?" No one answered. They didn't dare. "It was 4 years ago," Barkley said, voice even. 7-person recon unit dropped behind the land divide, remote terrain, no support. Their job was to confirm intel on a weapons facility that wasn't supposed to exist. He paused not for drama, but because saying it still cost something. What should have been 48 hours turned into 8 days. A ripple of movement. Someone shifted their boots in the dirt. They were ambushed on day 2, 2 killed instantly. One bled out before sunrise, one vanished, never recovered. His voice didn't rise, it only deepened. That left 3. The wind whispered over the field, soft and cold despite the sun. One had shrapnel embedded so deep in his chest he couldn't breathe. Another, the comms specialist, was unconscious. The third, she'd been shot through the thigh, 2 fractured ribs, no evac, no morphine, 12 miles of ice and shadow between her and survival. Every head in the formation was forward now. No one dared move. "She carried one man on her back," Barkley continued, "and dragged the other on a sled made from broken rifle straps and a snapped barrel. No backup, no air support, just grit." No one spoke, not even Huxley. Grace stood there, listening to a story she didn't need to hear. She lived it. In her mind, it wasn't the field she saw. It was snow. Blood on the snow. The sound of wind clawing at her lungs. The voice behind her, weak and broken, "If I pass out, don't stop. Keep walking." She had kept walking, crawling when she couldn't walk, breathing when she didn't want to. Now, years later, the same wind seemed to move through her chest again, whispering old ghosts awake. Her fists clenched, nails pressing into her palms. Not out of anger, out of memory. Barkley's tone hardened. "You think she came back for glory?" His eyes moved across the line of young faces. "She came back because not everyone who walks out of fire leaves the fire behind." A long silence followed. Grace's breathing steadied. The heat pressed down on her shoulders. She didn't flinch. One of the recruits near the back swallowed hard. They all knew now this wasn't just a soldier. This was a survivor, and survivors change the air around them. Barkley finally stepped closer, his boots stopping just in front of her. His voice dropped low enough only those nearest could hear. "She didn't ask for this assignment, she chose it. You think command sent her here as a favor? No." He looked at Huxley again. "She could have gone home, could have taken her discharge, could have disappeared quietly with honors and no questions asked." A pause, but she didn't. "She asked for the hardest post we have, training you, because she remembers what happens when training fails." The words sank like weight. No one moved. Barkley's tone softened, the steel turning to something almost human. "She didn't come back because she had to. She came back because she owed the ones who didn't." And in that instant, the story of Widow 27 wasn't legend anymore. It was standing in front of them, breathing, scarred, alive. Huxley's shoulders sank. The grin was gone, so was his voice. The rest of the squad stood straighter, not out of fear, but respect. The quiet kind that doesn't need to be taught. Grace Mallory hadn't spoken once. She didn't need to. Her silence had already said more than any speech could. The wind picked up again, tugging at her hair. The bruises on her arms caught the light, no longer marks of weakness but of history. Barkley turned to leave, his boots grinding softly over the dirt. "You've got one standing right in front of you," he said, half to himself, "and you didn't even know it." When he was gone, the silence stayed. It wasn't heavy anymore, it was reverent. Huxley finally looked up at her, eyes uncertain. Grace met his gaze, not cruel, not smug, just steady. A quiet kind of mercy that said, learn from this. Later that evening, when the mess hall filled with the usual buzz, trays clattering, chairs scraping, the air was different, quieter. Grace sat alone at a corner table. Same stillness, same careful movements, eating like someone who'd long stopped expecting company. Then one by one they came. No speeches, no apologies, just footsteps, a tray sliding across the table, another, then two more. They didn't look at her at first, they just sat, ate. Every few minutes someone glanced her way, not with pity, with understanding, recognition. It was Keller who finally asked, voice low, "Why widow 27?" Grace didn't look up, she took a slow breath. "Because I buried 26 of my team," she said. "I'm number 27. No one spoke again. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Because every soldier at that table now understood leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks with a limp. Sometimes it eats alone until others are ready to sit beside it. Grace finished her meal, stood, and without a word left the table. The others watched her go, no salute, no goodbye, just respect. That night, for the first time since she'd returned to Fort Kesler, she didn't eat alone. And somewhere outside, under the cold Wyoming stars, the ghost she carried seemed a little quieter. Because strength, she thought, isn't about who salutes you. It's about who finally understands why you never needed it. Why did the mornings always feel heavier after respect arrived? The next sunrise over Fort Kesler carried a different kind of silence. Not the awkward hush of soldiers waiting for orders, but the weight that settles when people have seen something they can't unsee. The recruits moved slower, more measured. Even the footsteps on gravel sounded softer, as if the ground itself had learned to listen. Sergeant Grace Mallory was already there when the others filed out, her boots planted in the cold dirt, eyes tracing the horizon. No clipboard, no whistle, no shouted commands, just a thermos of black coffee cooling beside her boot and a steady gaze that said you're late, even if they were. "Form up," she said quietly. Only 2 words, but they cut cleaner than any barked order. The squad scrambled into lines. Huxley, who yesterday would have smirked through every drill, stood stiff now, shoulders squared, jaw locked. He didn't meet her eyes. None of them did. Grace paced the line slowly, inspecting. No theatrics, no raised voice. Her silence made them nervous again, but this time for the right reasons. "Yesterday," she began, "you learned a name." A pause. "Today you'll learn what it means." She stopped in front of Keller, the youngest recruit, still trying to hide the tremor in his stance. "Ghost runs," she said. 5 miles, full gear, no cadence, no music. Just you and whatever's loudest in your head. No one complained, not even Huxley. "Move." The first few minutes of the run were chaos. Boots thudded, breaths came sharp, and the rhythm of effort filled the air. But somewhere past the first mile, the noise died down. That's when fatigue stopped being physical and started being personal. Grace jogged behind them, steady, unhurried. Every so often she'd glance toward one of them, not to measure their speed but their walls. She knew this part of training wasn't about endurance. It was about what happens when the noise fades and the ghosts start talking. Halfway through, Keller stumbled. His strap had loosened, rifle swinging awkwardly. Huxley, running beside him, reached out on instinct to catch him. The two collided, went down hard in the dirt. Grace didn't yell, she just stopped, watched. Huxley cursed under his breath, scrambled up. Keller started to apologize, but she raised a hand. "Don't," she said. "You'll waste oxygen." Her voice was flat, unreadable. Then she crouched beside Keller, checking the strap. "You tie your weapon like you tie your fear," she said. "Loose means you haven't decided if you're staying." Keller blinked, not sure if she was scolding him or saving him. "Yes, ma'am." Try again. They fixed the strap, stood, and kept running. When the unit finally reached the ridge, most dropped to their knees. Gasps tore through the morning air. Grace didn't flinch. She simply stood at the front, scanning the line. Rule 1, she said. You don't stop because it hurts. You stop when you can't remember why you started. A beat. Rule 2, you never forget Rule 1. Somewhere behind her, Huxley muttered something under his breath, a reflex, not defiance. She didn't catch the words, but the tone was familiar. Tired pride, maybe. The sound of a man realizing his limits weren't where he thought they were. Grace turned, Private Huxley. He froze, ma'am. She gestured to the incline. You think you're done? No, ma'am. Then go again. For a second he looked ready to argue. Then something shifted. Maybe it was the others watching. Maybe it was the memory of yesterday. He nodded once and took off back down the slope, boots pounding like pennants. The others watched in silence until he vanished around the bend. Grace didn't say a word. She waited. When Huxley returned, breathing hard, uniform soaked, she met his eyes. Not anger, not pride, just calm. That's what coming back looks like, she said. You fall, you return. He nodded once. It wasn't submission, it was acknowledgement. That afternoon, the training yard baked under the midday sun. The recruits were drilling marksmanship, controlled bursts, shifting targets, focus under fatigue. Grace walked the line with her usual quiet scrutiny. Every shot echoed, every miss rang louder. Keller's hands shook after his third miss. She crouched beside him, eyes narrowing on the sight alignment. Too much thought, she murmured. The rifle doesn't care about your fear. It only listens to your breath. He tried again, missed. Close your eyes, she said. He hesitated but obeyed. Now listen, what do you hear? He frowned. Wind, my heartbeat. Good, now breathe until those two things become one sound. The next shot cracked through the air, clean and centered. Bullseye. Keller lowered the rifle, eyes wide. She almost smiled, almost. Don't thank me, she said. Thank silence. Behind them, Huxley's voice carried. She teaching meditation or war. The words weren't cruel, but they were careless, and they hit harder than he meant. Grace didn't react, not right away. She turned toward him, slow, measured. You think those are different things, Private? He hesitated. No, ma'am. They are, until the first bullet flies. Then all you have left is your breath and prayer. Huxley looked down. Yes, ma'am. When the day ended, the sun dipped low, setting fire to the clouds. The recruits dispersed, leaving Grace alone on the range. She sat on the edge of the low concrete barrier, resting her elbows on her knees, watching the horizon. Barkley approached quietly, boots crunching against gravel. He stopped beside her, studying her profile. You ran them hard, he said. They needed it. They needed mercy, too. She exhaled through her nose. Mercy gets you killed. Barkley tilted his head. You don't believe that. She looked away toward the distant hills. I used to. For a long time, neither spoke. The air cooled, carrying the faint hum of the base generators. Somewhere far off, laughter drifted from the barracks. Life going on as it always does. You sleep at all? He asked. She shook her head. Not really. Still seeing them. Her throat tightened. Sometimes I hear them more than see them. The sound doesn't fade like it should. Barkley sighed softly. You don't have to keep paying for what you already survived. Grace's jaw flexed. Maybe survival is the debt. He didn't argue. He'd known her long enough to understand that her silence wasn't stubbornness. It was preservation. After he left, she stayed there a while longer, watching the light bleed out of the sky. Her scars itched where the old stitches had healed crooked, a reminder that the body keeps score even when the mind pretends not to. When she finally stood, her shadow stretched long across the dirt, thin and quiet, like a ghost that had forgotten how to leave. The next day, rain came. Not heavy, just enough to turn dust into mud and make everything smell like iron. Grace used it. She always used whatever the world gave her. "Today," she said, voice steady over the hiss of drizzle, "we fight mud. Because mud is what panic feels like, slow, heavy, sucking you down when you least expect it." The recruits blinked, half unsure if she was serious. Then she tossed Keller a rope. "Buddy carry drills, 60 seconds up, 60 down, no breaks." They groaned, but they obeyed. Huxley paired with Keller. The first run nearly dropped them both. Keller was lighter, but Huxley's footing slipped in the wet ground. He cursed, caught himself, and pushed through. The others followed, each pair stumbling, grunting, fighting the pull of the earth. Grace moved among them, correcting posture, adjusting weight distribution, barking short commands. "Use your legs, not your pride. Breathe through the strain. If you fall, fall forward." By the third rotation, every uniform was soaked, every lung burning. Then it happened. Keller tripped again, this time twisting his ankle badly enough that his cry sliced through the air. Huxley turned instantly, dropping to help. Grace was there before he could speak. She crouched beside Keller, eyes sharp. "You can stand." He winced. "I think so." "Then do it." He tried, failed, fell back into the mud. Huxley glared at her. "He's hurt." Grace's eyes snapped to him. "And he'll be worse if you teach him to quit." She grabbed Keller's wrist, pulled him upright, steadying him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "You breathe," she said. "In pain, out purpose." Slowly Keller balanced again, face pale but determined. "Good," she said. "Now finish the run, both of you." They did, limping, muddy, exhausted, but they finished. When they collapsed at the end, Grace finally knelt beside them. Her tone softened. "Pain teaches faster than comfort," she said quietly, "but comfort reminds you why you keep learning." Neither spoke. They just nodded, soaked to the bone, breathing hard. That night the barracks were quieter than usual. The recruits moved differently now, not faster but more aware. Less about proving, more about becoming. Grace passed their bunks silently, checking gear. When she reached Keller's cot, she found his boot propped up on a folded towel, ankle wrapped neatly. "You did good today," she said. He smiled faintly, didn't feel like it. "That's how you know it was." She turned to go, his voice stopped her. "Ma'am." She glanced back. "Do you ever stop seeing it, the ones you lost?" Her breath caught. The question hung there like smoke. "No," she said finally. "You just learn how to carry the silence between their names." Then she walked out, leaving the boy staring at the dark ceiling, trying to understand what kind of strength lived inside a woman like that. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moon cut through the clouds, silvering the edges of the base. Grace stood beneath it for a long time, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet. Because quiet for her was never peace. It was memory. It was ghosts learning to breathe through someone else. And yet, as the wind brushed against her cheek, she almost smiled. Maybe, just maybe, the ghosts were finally learning to rest. Because leadership, she thought, wasn't about breaking others to make them stronger. It was about showing them how to live with what never leaves. And when dawn came again, she'd be there. Waiting. Silent. Unshaken. Teaching them how to stand the way the fallen once did. Why does discipline always come just before doubt? 3 days after the rain, Fort Kesler woke under a hard, blue morning. The kind of sky that looked clean but carried a chill deep enough to make your breath visible. The recruits lined up on the range, boots still damp from yesterday's storm, rifles glinting with condensation. Grace Mallory stood in front of them, arms crossed, jaw tight. She'd barely slept again, too many dreams that weren't really dreams. Faces without voices, voices without faces. They blurred together now, stitched into the fabric of her every waking hour. But no one could see that. Not here, not in front of them. "Targets up," she ordered. Metal silhouettes rose from the mud, their outlines sharp against the pale sky. The recruits steadied their rifles. Huxley was front left, Keller beside him, both showing signs of exhaustion but also precision. Grace noticed. She always noticed. 3 rounds, controlled fire, she said. Remember, it's not about hitting the target. It's about understanding why you missed. The shots came in uneven bursts, staccato, echoing downrange. Grace walked behind the line, listening more than watching. Every trigger pull had a story. Hesitation, pride, fear, ego. You could hear all of it if you'd spent enough years in the field. When the firing stopped, she called out, "Cease." The echo faded. Smoke hung low over the range. She studied the targets through the binoculars. Half the squad had improved, half hadn't. But something else caught her attention, Keller's grouping. 3 perfect shots, center mass, dead clean. She lowered the binoculars slowly. "Keller." He froze. "Ma'am." "What you do different?" He hesitated. "Listened, ma'am, like you said, to the wind, the breath, and the space between." Grace's eyes softened just slightly. That's not bad advice to live by. A few recruits chuckled under their breath, relieved, human laughter. Grace let it happen. They needed it. The field had been too heavy for too long. Then Barclay's voice cut through from behind. "Sergeant Mallory." The recruits straightened instinctively. Grace turned to see him walking across the dirt, accompanied by a man she didn't recognize, tall, square-jawed, polished boots. Command type. The kind who smiled without meaning it. "Colonel Davis," Barclay introduced, "here to review our training protocols." Grace's stomach tightened. She already knew what that meant. Review never meant improve, it meant question. Davis nodded curtly. "Sergeant," he said, "heard you've been running these cadets a little unorthodox." Grace didn't blink. "Unorthodox gets results, sir." He smiled thinly. "So does discipline, but one's easier to control." Barclay stayed quiet, watching. Grace straightened, her tone still calm. "These recruits don't need control, sir. They need conviction." Davis circled slowly, scanning the line of muddy, tired faces. Conviction doesn't win wars, procedure does. Grace didn't respond. There were too many words that wanted to come out and none that would help. She learned long ago that some men didn't want truth. They wanted agreement. After a tense silence, Davis said, "I'll observe the next drill. Continue." Grace nodded once. "Yes, sir." The colonel stepped back. Barclay gave her the smallest nod, an unspoken, "I trust you. Do what you do." Grace turned back to the recruits. "Obstacle course," she said simply. The field was still slick from rain. Mud clung to everything, ropes, beams, walls, perfect conditions for failure, perfect conditions for truth. "Pair up," she ordered, "no favorites." When the whistle blew, chaos erupted. Boots thudded, bodies crashed, mud sprayed. Grace moved alongside them, her voice low but steady. Balance before speed. Commitment before comfort. Keller slipped at the second wall, caught himself, kept going. Huxley vaulted beside him, determination etched into every strained breath. They weren't competing anymore. They were surviving together. At the far end, 2 recruits struggled with the rope climb, Mendoza and Price. Price was heavier, exhausted, ready to give up. Mendoza reached the top, turned, saw him faltering below. Grace saw it too. "Help him," she called out. Mendoza hesitated. "Ma'am, he's slowing us." "Then slow down," she snapped. The words hit like a whip. Mendoza blinked, then reached down, grabbing Price's wrist. With one heave, one grunt of shared pain, they made it over. By the time the last recruit crossed, they were all coated in mud, panting, trembling. Davis looked unimpressed. "You call that training, Sergeant? They're exhausted. They're inefficient." Grace turned toward him, wiping sweat from her neck. "They're breathing, sir, and they'll remember this more than any classroom lecture." Davis frowned. "You're creating emotional dependency. They follow you, not the system." Grace met his gaze evenly. Maybe the system should be worth following. The air froze. Barclay's head tilted slightly, as if gauging how far he'd let this go. Davis stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not here to inspire, you're here to instruct." She didn't flinch. "Maybe you can't do one without the other." A long silence, then Davis turned away. "I'll be filing a report." He left. Barkley lingered. When the colonel was gone, Barkley sighed quietly. "You always did know how to make friends." Grace smirked faintly. "I'm not here to make them." "No," he said. "You're here because you never stopped fighting ghosts." She glanced at him, her face unreadable. "Maybe the ghosts fight me." That night the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain again, harder this time, as if the world wanted to wash something clean. The barracks buzzed with the restless sound of water hitting tin roofs and the faint murmur of voices. Grace sat alone in her quarters, the single desk lamp throwing long shadows across the walls. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped gauze around her wrist. Old injury. New ache. The past didn't always announce itself, it just arrived. She reached for the drawer and pulled out a folded photograph. 7 people smiling awkwardly in the cold. Snow in their hair. A woman at the center, her younger self, grinning, alive, unaware of what was coming. Her thumb brushed across the faces. She stopped on one, Captain Reyes, the only one she hadn't been able to bury, the only one who'd vanished. "If I pass out, don't stop." The memory came back so sharp, she had to close her eyes to breathe through it. When the knock came, she didn't answer immediately. "Come in," she said finally. It was Huxley, soaked, hesitant, eyes lowered. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you. I wanted to apologize." "For what?" she asked without looking up. "For running my mouth before. I didn't know who you were." She nodded slightly. "And now you do." He hesitated. "No, ma'am, but I'm starting to." That made her look at him. The words were clumsy, but the sincerity was. She studied him for a moment, then said softly, "Apologies accepted, but it's not needed." He frowned. "I think it is." Grace leaned back, folding the photo in her hand. "You don't owe me anything, Huxley. Just don't waste what you've been given." He looked at her hand. "That a photo?" She nodded once. "Old unit. Ghost line." Her jaw tightened. "Yeah." He shifted awkwardly. "You ever find the one who went missing?" She didn't answer right away. "No." "Would you want to?" Grace's eyes drifted to the window where the rain streaked the glass. Wanting and being ready are different things. Huxley nodded slowly, unsure what to say. "Well, for what it's worth, ma'am, we've got your back now." She gave the smallest smile. "Then maybe you're finally learning something worth keeping." When he left, she sat in silence again, the photo still in her hand. Her reflection in the window looked older than she felt. Or maybe exactly as old as she was, just tired enough to still be standing. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the parade ground. For a second, she saw it differently, not as it was, but as it had been. Snow instead of rain, blood instead of mud, a memory that refused to fade. She whispered the names under her breath, all 26, one by one, a ritual she performed every time the storm came. When she reached the last name, her voice cracked. The silence that followed was deeper than grief. It was acceptance wrapped in ache. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes, and stood. Because morning was only a few hours away, and she'd promised herself never to show weakness before sunrise. The next day, the colonel's report arrived at command. Barkley read it in silence, jaw working as his eyes skimmed the lines. Overexertion of recruits, lack of procedural adherence, emotional compromise. The words burned like bureaucratic poison. He found her at the range again, running the cadets through formation drills. He didn't interrupt until they broke. "Grace," he called, "walk with me." She joined him along the perimeter fence, mud crunching beneath their boots. He handed her the file. She didn't need to open it. "I assume it's bad," she said dryly. He grunted. "Depends who's reading it." They walked in silence for a while, the wind cutting across the open field. Finally, she said, "They think I'm too emotional." "They think you care too much," Barkley corrected, "and that scares them." She almost laughed. "Caring scares everyone, sir, especially soldiers." He nodded. "You know what they'll say, that you can't separate the past from the present." Her voice lowered. "Maybe I shouldn't." Barkley glanced at her, brow furrowed. "You mean that?" She stopped walking, turned to face him. "If I ever start training soldiers like I never lost anyone, then I've lost myself." He studied her a long moment. "You're not easy to defend, you know that." She smiled faintly. "Never have been." He looked away, exhaling. "They'll want a demonstration tomorrow, something clean, controlled, no emotion." Grace's lips pressed together. "Then they won't get me." "Grace." "No, sir, they'll get the truth, whether they like it or not." That night the base lights flickered against the dark, the hum of generators blending with the far-off thunder. In her quarters, Grace stared at her reflection in the mirror. The scar under her left eye caught the light, a thin, jagged reminder of what was left behind and what never would be. She whispered quietly, almost like a prayer, "Tomorrow they'll see what survival really looks like." Her voice cracked just slightly, "even if they never understand it." Outside, the rain began again, soft this time, almost kind. Because some storms don't come to destroy. They come to reveal who's still standing after the silence. Why do the hardest orders always sound the calmest? Morning at Fort Kesler broke too bright, one of those sterile, parade ground mornings that looked perfect on camera and felt wrong in the bones. The rain had dried overnight, leaving the air raw, thin, metallic. Grace Mallory stood beside the obstacle field, her hands behind her back, jaw tight enough to ache. Across the yard, white tents flapped in the wind. Command observers, clipboards, cameras, clean boots that had never known mud. At the center of them stood Colonel Davis, sunglasses reflecting the formation. Barkley was there too, arms folded, unreadable. The demonstration had been scheduled for 900. Controlled evaluation, Davis had called it. Grace knew what that meant, scripted. No failure, no risk, no emotion. A show, not a lesson. But soldiers didn't learn from shows. They learned from the edge. Her squad lined up, 12 cadets, uniforms crisp but eyes uncertain. Huxley front row, Keller limping slightly but refusing to fall behind. Grace could feel their nerves. They wanted to impress her, to prove something. She also knew command wanted proof of something else entirely, obedience. She stepped forward. "Today isn't about looking good," she said quietly. "It's about staying alive." A flicker of confusion crossed Keller's face. "Ma'am." Grace's eyes met his. "Just remember what I've taught you. Listen to the field, it talks before it kills." Davis clapped once, too sharp. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant." She nodded, signaled the start. The first phase was simple, coordinated movement through a simulated combat zone. Paper pop-ups, timed detonations, drone observers circling above. Everything looked clinical until the first charge misfired. A burst too close, louder than planned. Dust and debris slammed into the line. One cadet stumbled, another dropped flat. Grace's instinct kicked in before thought. Hand signal, stop, regroup. Davis barked from the perimeter, "Continue the sequence. Don't halt." Grace turned, voice cutting through the ringing air. "There's a misfire, sir. I'm not risking shrapnel for theatrics." "Sergeant," Davis said, stepping forward, "this is a controlled simulation. Proceed." Her pulse hammered. The smoke still hung thick. She could see fragments peppered in the mud. One wrong step and controlled could turn lethal. She faced her recruits. Their eyes were on her, waiting. Trust and fear side by side. She looked back at Davis. "Permission to verify range safety." "Denied." That word, it landed harder than the explosion. Grace exhaled once, slow. Orders or lives. It was never theoretical when you'd already watched both break. Then, without another word, she walked straight into the smoke. Barkley moved a step, stopped himself. He knew that look, knew stopping her would be like trying to halt weather. Inside the haze, everything went gray. The smell of burnt powder, wet earth. Grace crouched low, sweeping the ground with her glove. The charge housing was half buried, still hot. Faulty timer. One more spark and the next set would chain react. She shouted back, "Deactivate second line now." Davis started forward, furious. "Sergeant Mallory." But Barkley's voice boomed across the field, rough and final. "Stand down, Colonel." The silence that followed cracked like thunder. Grace cut the fuse wire, tossed it aside, and stepped back into view, streaked with dirt but steady. She pointed to the smoking pit. "Controlled enough for you, sir." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Barkley turned to the control tent. "End demonstration." Davis's jaw locked. "You just disobeyed a direct command." Grace looked at him, calm as stone. "No, sir, I followed the right one." That night, the debrief was brutal. Command packed into the operations trailer, screens humming, lights too bright. Grace sat opposite three officers, Davis at the center. Barkley stood behind her, silent, a wall that would absorb only so much impact. "Your insubordination undermined a live exercise," Davis said. "You embarrassed this base in front of oversight." Grace kept her voice level. "I prevented casualties." "You broke procedure." She leaned forward slightly. "Procedure nearly killed them." The youngest officer cleared his throat. "Sergeant, why didn't you wait for confirmation before entering the hazard zone?" "Because confirmation moves slower than detonation." No one replied. The room filled with the sound of machines, the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. Davis finally said, "You think your trauma gives you the right to rewrite doctrine?" Grace's eyes lifted. "No, sir. It gives me the right to recognize when doctrine forgets the human cost." Barkley's voice entered then, low but dangerous. "That's enough, Colonel." But Davis pressed. "She's unstable, General. We both know it. The report from medical still flags post-engagement symptoms. She shouldn't even be in the field." Grace's throat tightened. "You mean the part where I dream of dragging bodies through snow? I earned that, sir." Barkley stepped forward, palms flat on the table. "You'll get my formal statement by morning," he said coldly. "Until then, she remains on assignment." When the meeting ended, the hallway outside felt too empty. Grace walked until the echo of her own boots irritated her. Barkley caught up near the mess entrance. "You shouldn't have gone into that smoke," he said quietly. "I couldn't watch them die for a report." He nodded once. "I know." They stood there a moment, rain starting again outside the window, soft, hesitant drops. "Command not finished," Barkley said. "They'll dig." Grace smirked faintly. "They always do, they just never find what they're looking for." Back in the barracks, the recruits had heard enough whispers to know something had gone wrong. When Grace entered, conversation died instantly. Keller looked up from his bunk. "Ma'am, you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "Get some rest." But Huxley rose, fists clenched at his sides. "They're saying you almost got pulled off post." Grace stared at him. "Rumors travel faster than truth." "Is it true?" She hesitated. "They do like when you choose people over protocol." Keller frowned. "But isn't that what leaders do?" Grace gave a half-smile. "Sometimes, and sometimes it gets them court-martialed." A few nervous laughs, then silence again. She moved down the aisle, checking rifles, uniforms, small habits that steadied her. When she reached the end, Huxley spoke again, softer now. "We'd follow you anywhere, ma'am." She turned. The room was watching, not recruits now soldiers. Her throat tightened but her voice stayed even. "Then make it worth following." Later, alone, she opened her notebook. The pages were filled with fragments, training notes, mission times, scribbled sentences she barely remembered writing. "Silence isn't peace. Fear can teach if you let it." Leadership is staying when leaving would hurt less. She closed it, slid it beneath her pillow. Sleep didn't come easy, but exhaustion finally forced her under. And in the dream, it was snow again. The sound of breathing, hers and someone else. The taste of iron in the air. She looked down and saw Rias, barely conscious, his hand gripping hers. "Keep walking," he whispered. "I can't," she said. "You already are." When she woke, her cheeks were wet. She sat up slowly, rubbing her face, then looked toward the corner of the room where her gear hung. The rifle, the tags, the folded flag. Memory lined up like inventory. The intercom buzzed at 600. "Sergeant Mallory, report to command at 700. Davis was waiting, alone this time. He didn't sit. "The review's gone to regional. You'll stay on post until a decision's made." Grace nodded, understood. "You still believe you did the right thing?" She met his eyes, every second of it. He studied her a long moment. "You know what they call people like you in Washington? Liability." She smiled faintly, "Better than forgettable." He almost smiled back, almost, then said quietly, "You're not easy to dislike, Sergeant, but you make it effortless to worry about you." She turned toward the door. "Worry less, train better." When she left, he stayed staring at the file, fingers drumming on the cover, Widow 27. The myth was still inconveniently alive. That evening, Barclay found her on the firing range again, the sun low and red, wind whispering through the grass. "You ever get tired of proving them wrong?" he asked. She reloaded, fired, hit dead center, every day. He nodded toward the line of recruits watching from afar. "They're starting to believe in something bigger than the stories." Grace lowered her rifle. "Good, stories end, belief doesn't." He smiled. "You sound like Rias." Her breath caught. "You knew him." Barclay nodded slowly. "Long before Ghost Line, he was the one who recommended you for recon." Grace stared at the ground, emotions shifting like gravel under her boots. "He never told me." "He said you'd understand someday." She swallowed hard. Maybe today, that day. The wind carried their silence for a moment. Then Barclay said, "Whatever happens with the review, remember this. They can write what they want, but the people who have stood beside you, they're your record." Grace looked toward the horizon where the light was fading. "I'll hold them close, sir, even when the file says otherwise." That night, Keller and a few others sat outside the barracks, passing a thermos of weak coffee between them. The air was crisp, stars scattered like shrapnel. Huxley spoke quietly. "You think they'll really pull her?" Keller shook his head. "They'd be idiots." She broke orders. She saved lives. A pause, so did every name on that call sign. They fell silent after that, watching the faint glow from the training field where a lone figure still practiced in the dark. Inside her own mind, Grace heard Rias's voice again. "You already are." And maybe for the first time, she understood what he meant. Walking wasn't just about moving forward. It was about refusing to vanish, even when the world preferred your silence. She looked up at the stars, whispered under her breath, 27 still walking, Captain." Then she closed her eyes, breathed in the cold air, and let it settle in her chest like promise. Because sometimes survival isn't defiance. It's devotion. To the ones who didn't make it. To the ones who still can. And in that devotion, she finally felt something close to peace. Why does silence always come before change? The morning of the verdict felt colder than it should have been. Not in temperature, Wyoming was still dry and bright, but in the air itself. The kind of chill that doesn't come from weather but from waiting. Grace Mallory stood outside the command office, boots scuffing the concrete, her breath steady but her pulse not. She'd been here before, in different rooms, different years, waiting for men behind desks to decide if survival counted as disobedience. It rarely didn't. The door opened. Barclay stepped out first, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look said it all. "Come in," he finally murmured. Inside, Colonel Davis sat behind the long table, flanked by two officers who looked too young to be making decisions about someone like her. Their uniforms were perfect. Their eyes, nervous. "Sergeant Mallory," Davis began, his voice measured. "After review of your conduct during the October 7th demonstration, the panel has concluded that while your methods breached protocol, your actions directly prevented potential injury to cadets." Grace stayed still. She learned that stillness unnerved men who expected apologies. Davis continued, "As such, the panel recommends no disciplinary action, but also no commendation." Her lips curved slightly. Neutrality, the safest victory. He ignored the comment. "However, you are to suspend live training operations until further notice, effective immediately." Her throat tightened. "You're grounding me." "Temporarily," Davis said. "Command wants assurance your approach aligns with policy." Grace's jaw flexed once, then she nodded. "Understood." Barkley shifted beside her. "Sir, permission to—" "Denied," Davis cut in sharply. "This decision is final." The silence afterward was heavy, but clean, like the echo after a gunshot. Grace saluted. "Request permission to continue non-live training exercises while suspended." Davis eyed her. "Non-live?" "Yes, sir. Physical conditioning, leadership development, discipline drills." A long pause. "Finally approved, within limits." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." And with that, she turned and walked out before they could reconsider. The sun was blinding as she stepped outside. Barkley caught up to her halfway across the parade ground. "They're scared of you," he said simply. "Then they're smart," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "You going to play nice?" "I'll play honest. It's what they asked for. They just didn't know what it costs." He stopped walking, his voice softening. "Grace, don't let them turn you into the ghost they already think you are." She didn't answer. Her eyes were already fixed on the training yard where her squad was assembling, unaware that their instructor had just been benched. That afternoon she called them together. No weapons, no targets, just a circle in the dust. "New rules," she said, standing in the center. "Command wants structure, so we'll build it our way." Keller frowned. "Ma'am, they grounded live drills." Grace nodded, "For now." Huxley shifted, crossing his arms. "That's bull." She cut him off with a glance. "Language private." He bit it back, jaw tight. "Sorry, ma'am." Grace stepped closer to the group, her tone quiet but firm. "If we can't train with weapons, we train with what matters more, your heads, your guts, your voices." "Voices?" Keller asked. She pointed to her chest. "This is where combat starts. If you can't command yourself, you'll never command anyone else." They looked confused but curious. "Sit," she said. They did. And for the next hour, the field turned into something none of them expected. She didn't lecture. She asked questions. "What are you afraid of most when you wake up? What do you carry that no one else can see? What happens when the mission ends, but the noise does?" At first no one answered. Then Keller, of all people, spoke. "Forgetting," he said quietly. "My brother, he didn't make it back from his deployment. I'm scared I'll forget the sound of his voice." The field went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Grace nodded slowly. "Then don't carry it. The weight isn't meant to be gone, it's meant to keep you grounded." Huxley spoke next, voice low. "I'm scared of freezing, not fear, just freezing when it matters." Grace's eyes met his. "Then practice movement. Fear can't find you if you're already in motion." The others followed, small confessions, uneasy truths. And by the time the sun started dipping, the circle didn't feel like training anymore. It felt like therapy disguised as survival. When they dismissed, no one laughed or joked. They just walked slower, calmer, quieter. And for the first time, Grace didn't feel like their instructor. She felt like their memory keeper. That evening, Barkley found her sitting on the bleachers near the empty range. The sunset burned the horizon in orange and violet, the air thick with dust. "They're different," he said. "You've done something to them." She smirked faintly. "I made them listen." He sat beside her, groaning like old bones. "They're saying morale's higher than it's been in months." She didn't look at him. Until command decides morale isn't measurable. Barkley laughed softly, still bitter. "Always honest." A long pause, filled only by the distant thrum of engines. Finally, he said, "You ever think about leaving, starting over somewhere that doesn't smell like cordite and regret?" She stared at the horizon. "Every day." "Then why stay?" Her voice softened. "Because someone has to remind them that surviving isn't the same as living." He nodded slowly. "You sound like Rias again." Grace smiled faintly. "He'd hate that." "No," Barkley said quietly. "He'd be proud." Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. "You think he'd still recognize me?" Barkley looked at her, eyes full of something like fatherly ache. "I think he never stopped." Days passed. Training changed shape. They did endurance drills without rifles, communication games without radios. It wasn't conventional, but it worked. The recruits were sharper, more aware, more bonded. They began to move like a single mind, a single pulse. Then, on the 9th day of her suspension, command sent the letter. Barkley brought it himself, sealed in a thin folder. He didn't look happy. "Read it," he said. Grace unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the lines once, twice. Then she lowered it slowly. "They're reassigning me," she said quietly. "To where?" Barkley asked, already knowing. "Langton Facility," she replied. "Assessment Division." Barkley swore under his breath. "Paperwork, that's a desk job." Grace nodded once. "Permanent." He looked at her. "You'll appeal." She folded the letter carefully. "I won't win." "That never stopped you before." Her voice cracked slightly. "Maybe it should have." For a moment she looked older, tired in a way even scars couldn't explain. Barkley exhaled. "You walk out now, they'll call it a transfer. You stay and they'll make it punishment. Either way, they win." She met his eyes. "Then maybe winning isn't the point." That night Grace stood alone at the empty training field. Moonlight cut across the dirt, pale and cold. She could hear the laughter from the barracks, faint but real. The recruits had finally found their rhythm. They didn't need her to lead anymore. And that hurt in the best possible way. She walked to the center of the field, kneeling where the misfire crater had scarred the ground. The soil was darker there, rougher, like it still remembered. She placed her palm against it, whispering softly, "Ries, I did what you'd do." Her voice trembled. "I kept walking." When she stood, she noticed movement near the tents. Huxley, Keller, and 2 others were approaching, hesitant, carrying something. "Ma'am," Keller said, "we heard about the reassignment." Grace nodded. "Orders are orders." Huxley stepped forward, holding out a folded piece of canvas. "We made you something." She took it, unfolded it. A hand-painted flag, crude, rough-edged, streaked with training mud. In the center, in bold black strokes, Widow 27. Her breath caught. "You did this." Huxley nodded. "We figured legends deserve banners." She looked at them all, each face raw with honesty, and for once words failed her. Finally she said, "This isn't mine, it's ours." Keller smiled faintly. "We'll keep it flying, ma'am." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Then I can go." The next morning came quiet. Too quiet. Grace packed her gear without ceremony, folded her uniform, sealed her duffel, left her tag hanging on the locker hook for the next to wear. When she stepped out, Barkley was waiting by the vehicle bay. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her like someone memorizing what goodbye looks like. "You sure about this?" he asked finally. She nodded. They can move my post, sir. They can't move my purpose. He smiled sadly. You always were better at speeches. I don't give speeches, she said. I give echoes. They shook hands. His grip lingered. If you ever need to come back. I'll already be here, she said, tapping her chest once. Fort Kesler doesn't leave you. It just changes shape. As she turned to go, the recruits emerged from behind the bay. Formation, full gear, silent. Then without command they snapped to salute. Perfect, unified. Grace froze. Her throat burned. No music, no ceremony, just respect. She returned the salute slowly, her hand trembling halfway up before it steadied. And in that single motion, something ended and something else began. She climbed into the transport, engine rumbling to life. Through the window, she watched the field fade behind her, tents, mud, flags, faces. Her voice, low and steady, carried into the hum of the road. You train them so they don't need you. You love them so they don't break the way you did. And you leave so they learn how to stay. The road stretched out like memory, long, open, honest. And somewhere in the distance, the ghosts of Ghost Line walked beside her, quieter now. Because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is let go of the field that made her. Why do some wars begin after the last bullet's been fired? The road to Langton stretched across hours of silence, dust on the windshield, the hum of the engine like a heartbeat trying to stay steady. Grace Mallory sat in the passenger seat, helmet on her lap, fingers tracing the edge of her dog tags. The driver, a young corporal who spoke in half sentences, didn't ask questions. Maybe he'd been told not to. Maybe he just knew better. By the time they reached the facility, the sun was setting behind a line of flat, pale mountains. Langton didn't look like a base. It looked like a warehouse for forgotten people. Gray walls, razor wire, floodlights that hummed faintly even when there was no wind. The gate guard scanned her ID twice, slower than necessary. Widow 27, he murmured. Didn't think that was a real call sign. Grace gave a faint smile. Neither did I. Inside, the corridors smelled like dust and paperwork. Rows of steel desks, flickering monitors, faces lit by screens instead of daylight. She'd seen battlefields quieter than this. The silence here wasn't discipline, it was apathy. A captain with tired eyes met her at the entrance. Sergeant Mallory, welcome to Langton Facility, Assessment Division. You'll report to Wing C, Section 12. Assessment of what? She asked. He shrugged. Files, field reports, psychological evaluations, you'll see. He handed her a badge and walked away before she could ask more. Wing C was colder. Rows of filing cabinets, metal tables, stacks of unopened case folders. Most of the personnel looked like they'd been here too long, faces drained of purpose, uniforms clean but dull. They barely glanced up as she passed. Her workstation was small. One desk, one flickering lamp, one terminal that hummed faintly. The folder on top was labeled G47, Ghost Line Debrief. Her chest tightened. She opened it. The pages were redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out, names blurred. At the bottom, stamped in faint gray ink, closed, personnel deceased. Except one name. Mallory Grace E. Survivor. She closed the file quietly. Her reflection in the screen stared back, older, harder, but still breathing. The next folder was labeled Training Review, Fort Kesler. Davis's handwriting in the margin. Monitor subject's behavior. Evaluate post-traumatic influence on command structure. Her mouth went dry. They hadn't reassigned her to keep her safe. They'd buried her under paperwork to watch her break. She exhaled slowly. So this is the battlefield now, she muttered. By the third day, she learned Langton's rhythm. 700, arrival. 0800, 1700, file audits. 1700, debrief summaries. 1800, silence. The people here didn't speak much. When they did, it was in clipped phrases, numbers, classifications, evaluations. Human lives reduced to reports. On the fifth day, she found something strange. A sealed archive buried in the system, labeled Operation Lockfield. The access tag said, "Authorized personnel only, Widow Protocol Review." Her heart skipped. Widow, her call sign. The file was encrypted, but the title alone felt like a hand reaching out from the past. She flagged it, waited until the others had gone for lunch. Then, alone in the quiet hum of the archive, she overrode the lock. Old instincts took over: calm fingers, steady breath, patience like a weapon. The screen flickered, then words appeared. Subject: Rias, Captain Samuel J. Status: MIA, presumed KIA. Recovered data fragment, transmission 7A. Grace's breath caught. She pressed play. Static, then a faint voice, distorted, fatting. Repeat: South Ridge compromised. If anyone hears this, Mallory, don't come back. It's not what you think. The feed cut out. She froze. Rias, alive, at least long enough to send this. The report had said never recovered, but the timestamp on the file was dated 2 days after Ghost Line declared end. 2 days after she'd been rescued. Her pulse quickened. "You were alive," she whispered. "You." "Sergeant Mallory." The voice behind her snapped her upright. Colonel Davis stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes cold. "Sir," she said, masking her shock. "Didn't expect to find you digging through level 5 archives." "Just reviewing," she replied evenly. He stepped closer. "You accessed restricted material." "I found a discrepancy." He smiled thinly. "You found curiosity, dangerous trait in this department." Grace's hands curled at her sides. That file, Operation Lockfield, why was it marked Widow Protocol? Davis's tone flattened. "Because we learn from our mistakes, Sergeant, even the living ones." Her stomach turned. "You mean me?" "Precisely." He leaned closer. "You were never reassigned, Mallory. You were relocated for observation." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Observation for what?" He smiled again, too calm. "For the day you stop pretending you're fine." That night she couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan spun lazily above, the shadows flickering like ghosts. She stared at the folder she'd printed, Rias's fragment, blurry, incomplete. Her mind replayed his words. "Don't come back, it's not what you think." She remembered the mission. 7 deployed, 3 survived the first night, only 1 made it out. What had she missed? What had they hidden? The thought pressed heavy against her ribs. She built her whole return on honoring the fallen, but what if one hadn't fallen? She rose, threw on her jacket, and left the barracks. Outside, Langton was eerily still. Floodlights painted the yard in sterile blue-white. She followed the access road to the southern hangar, where old mission data was supposedly stored for audit. The door was locked. She bypassed it with a maintenance card she'd borrowed. The air inside was colder, smelling faintly of oil and metal, rows of crates, labeled and forgotten. She found it after 15 minutes, a container stamped GL-27, classified debrief footage. Her heart hammered. She pried it open. Inside, an old drive, manual encryption seal intact. She plugged it into a nearby console, static again. Then faint footage, a helmet cam view, snow blinding, heavy breath, movement through smoke. Her own voice. "Rias, we're pinned. Say again, Rias." A pause, then another voice, his. "We're not supposed to be here, Grace. They sent us to die." Then static, the screen glitched and stopped. Her body went still. The hum of the lights filled the void. "They sent us to die." The words echoed like a second heartbeat. By morning, she'd made a decision. Langton wasn't an archive. It was a cover, a place to bury the parts of war that couldn't be justified. She walked into Barclay's office. He'd arrived from Kesler for review meetings. He looked up in surprise. "Grace, you're supposed to be grounded." "I found something," she said, dropping the file on his desk. He read the first page, eyes narrowing. "Where did you?" "It doesn't matter. Rias's last transmission, 2 days after Ghost Line. They lied, sir." Barkley leaned back slowly, rubbing his face. "You shouldn't have this. And yet here we are." He sighed. "Grace, this could destroy your clearance, maybe your freedom." Her voice steadied. "Then tell me what Operation Lockfield really was." He hesitated. "You don't want that truth." "I've lived with worse." Barkley's jaw tightened. Finally, he said, "Ghost Line wasn't reconnaissance, it was containment. They sent you in to confirm a facility existed because we built it. Unauthorized weapons testing. When intel leaked, command buried the evidence. Rias must have found it." Her breath faltered. "So we weren't soldiers, we were witnesses." "Disposable ones," he said softly. She felt her knees weaken. "All this time I thought." "You were the mission, Grace," he said quietly. "Not the objective. You were meant to die with the truth." The words hit harder than any explosion she'd survived. She stepped back, shaking her head. "And when I did, they made you widow 27, he finished. For a long moment neither spoke. The weight between them was too heavy for words. Then Grace whispered, "He's still out there, Rias. That message, he was trying to send proof." Barkley looked at her, pain etched across his face. "Grace, if he was, someone made sure it never left Langton." "Then I'll find it." He shook his head. "They'll stop you." Her eyes hardened. "They've tried before." That evening she returned to Wing C, the file still in her bag. She didn't log in. She just sat, staring at the terminal, feeling the storm she'd kept buried for years start to rise. Her reflection in the screen looked different now, not broken, not haunted. Awake. She whispered to the ghost she'd carried, "You didn't die for nothing, not if I still breathe." And with that she began copying the files, one by one, quietly, methodically. Not to expose the world, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Because truth, like respect, wasn't something you shouted. It was something you carried until someone else was strong enough to take it from you. By midnight, the transfer was almost complete when the door opened behind her. "Sergeant," Davis said, voice cold as winter, "you couldn't leave the past alone, could you?" Grace didn't turn. "The past never left me." He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "Shut it down." "No. You're violating security law." "I'm honoring a promise." Davis reached for his sidearm, not out of threat but control. "You're not thinking clearly." Grace faced him then, eyes steady, calm. "I've never been clearer." They stared at each other across the dim light of the monitors, two soldiers on opposite sides of the same lie. Then Barkley's voice came from the doorway. "Put the gun down, Colonel." Davis froze. Barkley stepped inside, his badge already raised. "This facility under review. I've seen the files." Davis's expression cracked, first shock, then resignation. He lowered the weapon slowly. Grace exhaled. "You knew." Barkley nodded. "Long enough to know you'd find it anyway." When dawn came, the files were secured under joint review. Davis was taken into custody for evidence suppression. Langton went silent under investigation. Grace sat outside the facility, the sun rising pale over the horizon. Barkley joined her, 2 coffees in hand. "Still think neutrality's the safest victory?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Only for people who have never bled." He chuckled softly. "You're not done, you know." "Neither are the ghosts," she replied. "But maybe now they can rest a little easier." She took a long sip, the warmth grounding her. The road ahead was uncertain, maybe even shorter than she hoped, but it was hers again. And for the first time in years, she felt like the mission wasn't survival anymore. It was legacy. Because the truth wasn't her burden now. It was her weapon. Why does truth never come without collateral damage? The investigation at Langton began like a whisper and spread like fire through dry grass. One day, the hallways buzzed with the steady hum of machines. The next, every conversation lowered to a murmur. Files vanished. Doors that had always been open now required clearance. People stopped making eye contact. Grace Mallory had seen fear before in battlefields, in ambushes, in the hollow quiet before a mortar strike. But this kind was colder, bureaucratic fear. The kind that didn't kill you fast, it just erased your name one page at a time. She kept working anyway, she always had. Each morning she walked past the guards who now saluted with uncertainty, down corridors lined with boxes labeled temporary hold, do not distribute. Her new station was a small office beside Barclay's makeshift command post. Together they were part of a review team, though both knew what that really meant. Containment wrapped in procedure. Barclay looked worse every day, eyes red from sleepless nights, temper fraying. Grace noticed. She said nothing. That was their unspoken agreement to hold each other together by pretending they weren't falling apart. The first week of the inquiry brought a wave of statements. Junior officers confessed to seeing redacted orders, to shredding logs. None of it touched the top brass. It never did. The further the truth climbed, the quieter it got. On the seventh night, Grace sat alone in the archives again, listening to the hum of the servers. The files she'd copied were secured off-site now, locked in a sealed drive under Barclay's authority, but something still felt unfinished. Rias's last transmission echoed in her head. It's not what you think. She opened the system again. One folder remained untouched, GL-27 recovered personnel data. She clicked. Inside were medical scans, DNA reports, fragments of photos. At the end of the list, a single line flickered. Subject 27B, status, containment pending transfer. Her pulse slowed. Subject 27B, a second file, a second widow. She opened it. The image loaded grainy surveillance stills of a man in restraints, face hidden, time-stamped months after ghost line. The tag read, Rias, Samuel J., non-compliant asset. Grace's heart stopped. He hadn't died. He'd been captured, held. She barely noticed Barclay enter behind her. Grace, he said quietly, what did you find now? She turned the monitor toward him. For a moment the general said nothing. Then his jaw tightened. Jesus. He's alive, she whispered. They kept him. Barclay rubbed his temples. Or they had him. That timestamp's 2 years old. She stood, shaking her head. If he's anywhere, it'll be in the Black Site network. Lockfield wasn't just a mission, it was a test site. They'd hide survivors under a different project name. Barclay exhaled slowly. Grace, listen to me. You start pulling at this thread, they'll erase you again, permanently this time. She looked at him. Then they'd better hurry. 2 days later, an unmarked convoy arrived at Langton. 3 SUVs, blacked-out windows. Inside the lobby, whispers spread. Internal affairs or worse. The lead investigator introduced himself simply as Director Miles. Polished, quiet, the kind of man whose calm was more dangerous than rage. He summoned Barclay and Grace to briefing within the hour. Sergeant Mallory, Miles began, his tone smooth. We appreciate your enthusiasm for truth. However, some of your actions have complicated ongoing national interests. Grace held his gaze. Truth tends to do that. He smiled faintly. You've released no data. No, sir. Everything is secured. Good. Then we can close this without unnecessary escalation. Barclay shifted. Meaning what? Miles's expression didn't change. Meaning Langton returns to operational silence, files sealed, personnel reassigned. Grace frowned. Reassigned where? He met her eyes, classified. She understood immediately. They were burying it again. Her voice steadied. There's someone still alive in those files. You can't just... Miles cut her off. Sergeant, the country thanks you for your service, but this conversation is over. Barclay's fists clenched at his sides. With respect, Director, we've already buried too many. Then one more won't matter, Miles said softly. The room went silent. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. You people never change. That night she sat in her quarters staring at the drive Barclay had slipped her hours before. If they shut us down, you run this yourself, he'd said. She hadn't asked how he'd copied it. Some debts didn't need explanation. The drive contained everything, the transmissions, the facility logs, and the footage of Reyes. Proof. All she had to do was decide what to do with it. Expose it and risk every recruit still in training, every innocent still under command. Stay silent and let the ghosts keep screaming through classified walls. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly through the storm. The memory came unbidden, Reyes's voice in the snow, broken and soft. You already are. Maybe this was what he meant. That surviving was just the beginning. The rest was what you did with it. At 300 she moved. No orders, no witnesses. She slipped through Langton's service corridors with the quiet precision of someone who'd memorized every blind spot. The drive sat warm against her chest. Her destination wasn't the gate. It was the comms relay on the roof, the only node with outside access before the blackout protocols kicked in at dawn. Wind howled through the antennas. Floodlights swept the yard below. She plugged the drive into the uplink, encryption spinning. 10%, 20, 30. Then the intercom crackled. Unauthorized data activity detected. Section Alpha lockdown in progress. She muttered, too late. Footsteps echoed up the stairwell, heavy, fast. Davis wasn't gone after all. He appeared at the doorway, sidearm drawn, shouting over the wind. Mallory, stop. She didn't turn. 65%. Don't make me do this, he called. Then don't, she said calmly. He hesitated. You'll destroy everything you swore to protect. She looked at him then, eyes steady. I'm protecting the part you forgot mattered. Barclay's voice came faintly through her earpiece. Grace Security's inbound, 2 minutes. Copy, she said, 85%. Davis stepped closer. You think this makes you a hero? You'll burn the army from the inside. She almost smiled. Maybe it needs a little fire. 90%. Then a single shot cracked the air. Not his. A warning round from the yard below, security snipers. The wind ripped the sound away before it could echo. Davis flinched. She didn't. Upload complete. Grace ejected the drive, pocketed it, and faced him fully. Too late. He looked past her at the relay lights, all flashing red, data streaming out to external secure servers. His face fell. What did you do? I made sure they can't erase the dead twice. By dawn she was gone. Barclay found her barracks empty, bed neatly made, tags missing. Only the Widow 27 flag remained, folded at the footlocker. Miles ordered a full search. Nothing. She'd vanished between checkpoints like a ghost. Official reports claimed Sergeant Grace Mallory deserted duty following data breach. Unofficial whispers called it something else, Operation Echo Fall, a name that lived in the spaces where silence didn't reach. Months passed. Langton shut down quietly, its staff reassigned, its records sealed under new code names. Barclay was transferred to a desk in D.C., his voice ignored in every meeting that mattered. But sometimes late at night he'd receive anonymous packets, encrypted, unsigned. Inside, small truths. Leaked audits, survivor testimonies, coordinates. Each message signed with the same line. For the ones who walked through fire, 27 still walking. He never replied, just saved them one by one. A year later, on a cold February morning, a reporter released a story citing undisclosed military misconduct. Names redacted, locations unnamed, but those who'd served in Ghost Line recognized every detail. The article ended with a single quote. Sometimes command forgets the cost of silence. Sometimes silence reminds them. Anonymous veteran, call sign Widow 27. Barkley read it twice, then leaned back, eyes stinging. For the first time in decades, he smiled without bitterness. Far from Washington, in a small mountain town, a woman in a worn jacket walked past a memorial wall. Her hair shorter now, streaked with gray. No rank, no medals, just peace. She stopped at the last plaque, Captain Samuel J. Reyes, presumed fallen. A faint smile touched her lips. Not fallen, she whispered, just waiting. She placed a single dog tag beneath his name, her own, and stepped back. Because legacy wasn't about living forever. It was about leaving something that does. The wind caught her coat as she turned down the road, her silhouette framed in early sunlight. Somewhere behind her, the world she'd fought to expose kept turning a little more honest, a little less cruel. And though her name might fade from reports, every soldier who'd ever heard the legend of Widow 27 would remember what it really meant. Strength isn't loud. Truth isn't safe. And heroes aren't always the ones who come home. Why does peace feel heavier than war? Dawn came slowly over the mountains, dragging a gray light across the valley. The town below still slept, just the smell of rain on asphalt, the hum of a distant train, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from anyone. Grace Mallory stood on the ridge above it, hands deep in her jacket pockets, eyes tracing the line where the sky met the earth. She'd been there since before sunrise, as if waiting for the world to wake up before she could let herself belong to it again. It had been 6 months since the article, 6 months since she'd set fire to a silence that had buried too many. The story spread and then, as all truths do, faded into headlines, then into rumor, then into history. She hadn't expected thanks. She hadn't expected absolution either. Just air. Just space to breathe without permission. The locals knew her as the woman at the edge of town. She repaired engines for a living now, tractors, trucks, sometimes the old Jeeps from a nearby reserve unit. Work that smelled of oil and purpose. Simple. Honest. Every morning she cleaned her hands with solvent that never quite erased the black stains, and every night she sat on the porch listening to the wind move through pine needles, pretending it sounded like waves on snow. The ghosts were quieter here, but they hadn't left. They never would. She learned to live with them the way you live with scars, acknowledging, not fearing. One morning she found an envelope in her mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in block letters that looked military. Inside, a folded photograph, a group of new recruits at Fort Kesler standing beneath a hand-painted flag. Widow 27. Beneath it, a handwritten note. They still talk about you, ma'am. We keep the field clean. Keller. Her throat tightened. For a long time she just stared at it, thumb tracing the edges. The field looked smaller in the picture, but the faces looked larger, brighter, steadier. She pinned it above her workbench, right beside a faded mission patch from Ghost Line. Past and present, side by side, not competing, just existing. A few days later, Barkley found her. She saw the SUV long before it reached the ridge, recognized the silhouette even before the door opened. He looked older, heavier, but his eyes still carried the same mix of steel and exhaustion. "General," she said softly. "Retired," he corrected, smiling. "Just Thomas now." She gestured to the porch. "Coffee's cheap but strong." He accepted, lowering himself onto the step beside her. For a while, they just watched the valley breathe. "You disappeared," he said finally. "You let me," she replied. He nodded. They closed Langton, quietly. Davis took a plea. Miles moved to private defense contracts, far away from anything with a conscience. She said nothing. "They called you a leak, you know, then a legend, then nothing. I guess that means you did it right." Grace smiled faintly. "Legends don't pay rent." "Maybe not," he said, "but they build foundations." She looked at him then, really looked, at the man who'd once stood on a ridge watching her being mocked, who'd chosen silence until it mattered. "You could have stopped me," she said. He shook his head. You never needed permission, just someone to witness you. They sat in easy silence for a while, the wind whistling low through the wires above them. Finally he asked, You ever think about coming back? She chuckled. To what? To teach again. Not recruits this time. Officers. Ethics, leadership, truth, whatever they call it when they're trying to remember what it means to be human. She sipped her coffee. Truth gets expensive the higher it climbs. He smiled. Then maybe it's time someone rich in scars pays the bill. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about his words, about Keller's letter, about the faces on that flag. She'd spent years teaching people how to survive war. Maybe now it was time to teach them how to survive themselves. She stepped outside. The air was cold, the sky wide and clear. She looked up and whispered to no one in particular, What do you think, Reyes? The wind answered softly, bending the grass. She took that as a yes. A week later, she returned to Fort Kesler. No escort this time, no orders, just a visitor's badge and a heart that beat harder than it should have. The base looked different, new paint, new faces, but the air smelled the same, dust, oil, determination. When she stepped onto the field, conversation stopped. Not fear, recognition. The kind of pause that happens when rumor suddenly becomes real. Keller was there, older now, a sergeant himself. He approached, grin half hidden. Permission to hug, ma'am. Denied, she said, then pulled him in anyway. He laughed, the sound breaking something heavy between them. They told us you retired. Retirement's just a new front line, she said. You hold the flag. He nodded proudly. Every graduation. She looked around. New recruits trained in the distance, mud, sweat, chaos. The same cycle continuing but cleaner somehow, more awake. Keller followed her gaze. They still tell your story. Which one? The one about the smoke, the general, the silence. She smiled faintly. That one's theirs now. Later in Barclay's old office, now Keller's, she stood at the window overlooking the yard. You ever miss the fight? He asked. Every day, she said, but I don't miss who I had to be to survive it. He nodded slowly. I think that's why you won. She shook her head. No one wins, Keller. We just learn what losing can teach. He studied her face, the calm, the quiet gravity, and said softly, Then you taught us well. Before she left, she walked the perimeter one last time. The wind carried the sound of distant shouting, drill cadence, laughter, life. She stopped at the same rise where Barclay had once stood watching her. The field shimmered under the afternoon light, and for a brief moment she saw it as it had been, muddy, hostile, filled with ghosts. Then the image shifted, and she saw what it had become, a place where silence no longer meant shame but strength. She whispered, You did good, kids. A tear slid down, unhurried, unashamed, the kind of tear that cleans instead of burns. Weeks passed. She accepted Barclay's offer unofficially at first, lectures at small academies, talks on leadership and resilience. No fanfare, no rank, just a woman telling truths that didn't fit into manuals. She never mentioned names, never mentioned operations. She just told stories that sounded like parables. Sometimes you don't come back the same, and that's okay. Sometimes strength is just choosing to walk through the door again. Sometimes silence is the loudest courage of all. Cadets listened. Some cried quietly. Some looked away, pretending they didn't, but every single one remembered. Because she didn't speak like an instructor. She spoke like someone who'd already paid the price. Years blurred. The world moved on. Wars ended, others began. Her name faded from the rosters, from the files, from the lips of men who built their careers on forgetfulness. But in classrooms, in training grounds, in whispers around campfires, they still said it. Widow 27. A myth again, but this time a kind one. On her 62nd birthday, she visited the National Memorial in D.C. Rain fell steady, soaking the marble, blurring the carved names into streaks of silver. She walked slowly along the wall, fingertips brushing letters she'd once memorized. When she found Riis, she stopped. For a long time she just stood there, rain dripping from her hair, the sound of thunder distant but constant. "Hey, Captain," she whispered. "They finally told the truth, took Em a while." She smiled through the tears. "You were right, it wasn't what I thought, it was worse, but it's done now." From her pocket she pulled a small brass emblem, an old unit insignia, polished smooth by years of carrying. She placed it at the base of his name. "Rest easy," she said. "Your fire's still burning." Then she stepped back, raised her hand in a slow, silent salute. No cameras, no audience, just her and the rain. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the ghosts finally exhale. That night, she stayed in a small motel outside the city. The power flickered during a storm, and she found herself writing by candlelight in the same old notebook she'd carried since Fort Kesler. She wrote slowly, deliberately, words like promises. "If they ever ask who I was, tell them I was the one who listened. Tell them I wasn't fearless, I was faithful. Tell them I didn't win, I endured." When she finished, she closed the notebook, smiled, and whispered the same line she'd told her recruits years ago. "Respect earned in silence lasts longer than applause." She blew out the candle. The flame died with a soft hiss, leaving only the sound of rain and the faint echo of memory. In the years that followed, the world rarely spoke her name, but on quiet mornings at Fort Kesler, new recruits still stood before the Widow 27 flag before their first deployment. No ceremony, no speeches, just a moment of silence, long enough to feel the weight of those who'd walked before them. And somewhere far away, in a town hidden by mountains, a woman with gray hair and calm eyes woke early, brewed her coffee, and looked toward the sunrise. The same sunrise that rose over every base, every battlefield, every name carved in stone. She didn't need to see the flag to know it was still flying. She didn't need to hear the voices to know they still remembered. Because legacy doesn't need witnesses. It just needs one person who refuses to forget. Grace Mallory smiled, the kind of smile that comes after forgiveness, quiet, complete, earned. She whispered one last time to herself, to Riis, to every ghost still listening. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.